the church before we have our dinner. And his is one that some of you have read and some of you have heard before about his experiences during the war. So some of you suggested that I should do one too. So here goes. I recall with special tension one particular period of 6 years. Can you hear me over here?
Yes.
Okay. From 1935 to 1941. Those years were full of turbulence and change, hope and dread, disappointment, pride. The country, the whole country, was badly divided over national policies and attitudes, such as pacifism versus preparedness, internationalism versus isolationism, the rights of labor versus the power of the capitalists, pro and anti-communism, pro and anti-fascism, anti-Semitism, pro-segregation, and anti-Catholicism. These divisions are still with us, but I felt their pressures personally because my father was a very prominent Republican and a close friend of Senator Taft of Ohio. My father was also an officer in a steel foundry company. He was relatively indifferent to and uninvolved with anything outside of this country. He knew or cared very little about Europe or the Far East. But I was going to a very liberal and activist college with a president who was known throughout the country for his work for world peace and his opposition to arms and the military. Our campus was visited by speakers for every possible cause, the good ones and the bad ones, and we were in a constant state of learning and turmoil. When I graduated from high school in 1935, I felt smart and successful and fearless. I ranked 18th in the state of Ohio for the test that they gave to seniors, and our debate team, of which I was a member, were state champions. I was editor of the yearbook and was going to the best college in Ohio. Never mind the depression, I had everything I wanted, including a car and a boyfriend. Never mind that my father's Republican Party had been beaten by that Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt. My life in Lima, Ohio was safe and stable and clad in hubris. What a difference when I got to Oberlin College. I met kids from the East who had aced the New York state boards. Kids who grew up in South Africa and Japan and India and China. These kids read the Sunday New York Times and they listened to the New York Philharmonic concerts on the radio Sunday afternoons. Some of them were dedicated radicals, called themselves communists, and read Karl Marx. Suddenly, I was not first in my classes. I was not sophisticated. I was not especially admired, and I wasn't even very well informed. During my 4 years at Oberlin, the terrible turmoil in the world became our daily conversation. The Popular Front in Spain, the rise of Hitler, the threat of Stalin, the appeal of pacifism, the logic of isolationism, the betrayal at Munich. All of these these events, which were destroying the world, forced me and my friends to face awful realities early. We didn't just study Western Civ, we watched it being destroyed. I remember writing a very self-righteous letter to one of my best friends from Lima who had gone on to Annapolis. I berated him for being a militarist and a tool of warmongers. He was later killed at Midway when his carrier was sunk. I remember a farewell party for another friend who dropped out of college to go and fight fascism in Spain. He was killed there. I remember a dinner, excuse me, when I sat next to the president of the United Steelworkers Union. He had been given a speech at the Students' Public Affairs Society, whose president I was dating at the time, so I ended up at the dinner to the right of the speaker. At that time, my father was president of the Steel Foundry Society of America. Each man thought the other was a menace to the country, and I felt confused and upset. My two mentors in the political science department, in which I majored, expected me to go on to graduate school, at least for a master's degree. One professor was a passionate Jeffersonian, and I practically memorized the Federalist Papers and the Monroe Doctrine and the decisions of Chief Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court. The chairman of the department was an academic refugee from Hungary. He had had to leave his post position there because he protested growing Stalinism. He assigned me to write a new charter for a reborn League of Nations with some teeth and some power. But my Cleveland eye doctor advised me against more years of intensive reading after changing the prescription in my glasses 3 times in 4 years. So I dropped out of the senior honors program and gave up my job of grading freshman blue books, and I abandoned graduate school applications and dreaded commencement. I had permission to have a car at Oberlin in the spring of my senior year so I could do first-hand research in Cleveland for my senior thesis. My topic was overlapping governmental units in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. But this riveting subject did not protect me from the daily news and the stories of the growing war in Europe. Hitler and Stalin were conquering Europe country by country. Greece, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, and France. It was known that Hitler had killed hundreds of German Jews in Kristallnacht, and there were rumors of concentration camps all over Europe. In September, after we graduated, World War II was declared in Europe as Hitler marched into Poland. It was obvious that if we hoped to save Western civilization as we knew it, we would have to fight. I felt increasingly estranged from my father, who was outraged by union organizing and sit-in strikes. He believed that Franklin Roosevelt's social security system would be the end of personal frugality, family savings, and individual responsibility. When I ran into Sherry Moran in Cleveland in the fall after we graduated, we barely knew each other. We were both floundering and depressed. He had no job, no money, and no family in this country. In fact, he had not even seen his parents for more than 3 years. And the news from Japan, with its forays into Korea and China, was just as bad as the news from Europe. Sherry and I were both in the process of breaking up with college sweethearts and apparently ready for a compatible friendship and a new romance to help us face the future. We quickly fell in love, and by New Year's of 1940, we were engaged. I was back home in Lima taking care of the house and of my mother, who had been in an accident. Sherry was starting a new job in Pittsburgh, which required him to attend Carnegie Tech night school. Marriage looked a long way off. But in June of 1940, after the fall of France and the evacuation from Dunkirk of the British army of 340,000 men across the Channel, the Battle of Britain began. I remember throwing a tantrum to my parents and swearing that we would be married as soon as possible, before Sherry could be sent off to war. So on October 13th, 1940, we had a very quiet ceremony at home. I felt decades older and a very different person from 5 years previously when I left for college. We had 13 months of a normal married life in Pittsburgh until December 6th, 1941, when my hoped-for pregnancy was confirmed by my doctor, to our great joy. The next day, as usual, we were listening to the Philharmonic Sunday afternoon broadcast. Sherry was doing his homework for Carnegie Tech. I was knitting, and our cat, named Susie, was playing with my yarn. We heard suddenly the news with horror and resignation that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese and that war would be declared the next day. It was almost a relief to face finally what I had feared and dreaded for the last 5 years. They certainly were momentous events for everybody. And of course the dropping of the bomb, as you all know, is still a subject of great controversy.
Sure.
We, from the perspective that we had at that time, we agreed with it, of course not knowing much about it, but it was a case of anything to stop the war. You know, Grandpa Sherwood was poised to, in San Diego, wasn't San Diego, to go in with the 1st Marines in a invasion of Japan. And I think that many people would agree that that kind of invasion of Japan would have killed more people than the bomb did. Now that doesn't necessarily justify our doing something that we didn't know, didn't understand what was going to happen, didn't know the impact on the people that were killed, particularly. But at the time, you know, we felt anything that would prevent our having to land and march through and kill our way through Japan was a good thing. In fact, didn't we hear in Pomona that actually more Japanese were killed by the bombing, the previous to the atomic bomb, than were killed by the atomic bomb?
It
was one more awful thing that
definite fact. It's not an estimate.
Mom, let me ask you a question, and could you say just a few words about how kind of different it was earlier and how that whole process went?
Well, the Springfield, Ohio was probably fairly typical, neither worse nor better than most Midwest small towns. There was a lot of intolerance and non-acceptance of people, but it was not a violent one. It was kind of a drawing away and frowning. When after the war, when Daddy went to work at Kroll Collier in Springfield, why were we entertaining Japanese? I don't know. I can't remember exactly why, but
Why, just there.
he worked for this great big printing company that did Collier's magazine and the Woman's Home Companion and several other magazines. And they were printed in Springfield. The headquarters were in New York. But there were often visitors because it had a lot of modern printing equipment. There were often visitors who came from out of the country and out from New York. And we were often asked to entertain them, partly because Daddy was one of only 2 college graduates in this company that had 2,000 employees and 11 unions. 11 unions. So the fact that we could and would talk to people and be, presentable and hospitable and everything meant that we had some famous people, Britt Bennett Cerf, for instance, but we also had some visiting Japanese and blacks. Anyhow, we took them to the country club for dinner. We belonged to the country club, and at that time in our lives, while we did not like some of the policies of the country club, it was not, the issue had not become so major that we resigned from the club, which we did later. But at that point, we used the country club because Ted played golf and the kids liked to swim. And so we took these visiting people there. Well, the first time I walked into the country club, this would now be 50. With a visiting Japanese, there was indeed a gasp. Now, we were not, thrown out, and nobody threw bombs. But it was the country, and at least where we lived, was on the cusp of the civil rights period. And we had some interesting experiences when we were working with the symphony. As you all know, or David knows, because we talked about it, one of the symphony events when Daddy was president was the Modern Jazz Quartet. Now, I don't know if the young people know the Modern Jazz Quartet, but they were a very famous quartet of 4 black men, and who are still, some of them, Milt Jackson, I think, is still.
They're still around.
Yeah, they are. Anyhow, so it was our, we were also to be the hosts for the Modern Jazz Quartet. And I went in our station wagon to the airport in Dayton to pick them up, and somebody else drove a U-Haul because one of the quartet played the xylophone, yeah. So we couldn't get that in the car. Anyhow, it was meeting them, identifying them, introducing myself, gathering their luggage, and getting the whole entourage on the way was kind of a scene at Vandalia that they had not often seen. We did not feel able to take them out to dinner. We often took the symphony soloists out to the club or someplace to dinner. But we didn't quite have the nerve to walk into the country club with the 4 Modern Jazz Quartets. So we had them have dinner at home. and had them.
All the help at the country club was
Oh, that's
African American.
right, that's
Harvey.
right.
Harvey, remember Harvey?
Harvey, the head waiter at the country club, who was our dear friend and a friend of my father's, was one of the
Named
most
after him.
one of the most indignant about the people that we sometimes brought to the country club.
But you gave a dinner for them at home for other people?
No, we just had the 4 modern jazz quartet. That was the safest thing to do.
Leftovers.
They were very pleasant, very offish, very careful. And it was funny, as I drove them home to Springfield from the airport in Dayton, I tried to make conversation. I tried to be not only hospitable, but educational. So I would say to them, now here is the Wright-Patterson field where the bombers take off every 4 hours to fly over something or other. And then we drive a little farther and I would say, and these are Angus cattle. And these 4 eyes would go this way and this way. They thought I was crazy.
No.
You know, I said, here's the waterworks.
Yes, there's that Oberlin girl again.
Here's the waterworks.
It's the waterworks.
Here's the town.
Right.
That's funny.
But would they have to stay in some hotels and
No,
not
they
in
stayed
others?
in the Shawnee Hotel, and we had, that had been carefully worked out in the range. And they ate in there, had breakfast in the coffee room. And that, as I say, had been carefully planned. But they were very tense. They were very good musicians. Well, even the orchestra was a little taken aback to play with modern jazz quartet. But as I have said before, we were comparatively active, comparatively liberal, but not heroic. We did not, well, I only remember marching once, and I can't remember what the occasion was, but it was in a civil rights march. And
Fair housing. Fair housing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's right.
And the button?
And the buttons?
The button with the black and white
Two.
hand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember that.
The cooks and
And
Sickle, Student Committee on Civil
who
Liberties.
was the basketball player?
That's
Al
right.
Thrasher.
Al Thrasher.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Harchies.
Then that, yeah.
No, but David, I mean,
Saying this in his speech, but at any rate, almost immediately, he went to Washington and made calls at the FBI, the Navy, and the Army to offer himself, because he could speak Japanese very well with a unusually good accent. And the Navy took him, but said he had to go to a special language school in Boulder to learn to read and write Japanese. He just spoke it as a kid does growing up. You hear the language around you and pick it up. So he was sent, he was told to report to Berkeley, California, to the university for this new language school that the Navy had started, pay his own way, and he would be, his rank would be yeoman second class until he graduated from the school. So by then Susan had been born, and we had given up our apartment. He had quit his job in Pittsburgh. We had sold most of our wedding presents because we had not saved money for our income tax. That was one of the first major lessons in married life. Was that,
And here you had supported the taxation system.
yes, we were in favor of taxes. We just hadn't saved the money for it. So we sold our wedding presents. Anyhow, so I went home to back to my family in Springfield, Ohio with the baby, and Daddy went to Berkeley. But as a special treat, I went back with him to Chicago, and he took off from there, so that we had 2 days and a night, or 2 nights and a day, or something like that, without the baby, whom I left with my parents, and we went to Chicago. And we had a day of just kind of walking up and down, what's the main drag in Chicago?
Michigan Ave.
Michigan Avenue. And we stopped at a jewelry store that we didn't know much about, but it turned out to be Peacock's, which is still in existence and one of the famous jewelry stores in the country. Anyhow, Daddy decided suddenly that he wanted to give me a ring. I had not had an engagement ring because he had no money. And I think I had bought our wedding ring because he had money.
Don't tell all the secrets.
So he took the tax money.
So anyhow, we went into Peacock's, and I had some diamonds that I'd inherited from my grandmother. And he and the salesman drew a picture, kind of an Art Deco style. And if you see the ring, you'll see that it's unusual. So that was his parting gift for me to remember him by. We were fixated on his being killed, which I'm sure was my style, not particularly his. So by then I was pregnant again, and we had this 6-month-old baby. So he decided he wanted to give me this ring to remember him by. And I really felt I had a lot of things to remember him by. But anyhow, so I wore that ring.
And if you need it for taxes.
Was a beautiful one. And at some point, within the last 5 or 10 years, I gave it to Julie, and she had it reset to fit her. And so that's her inheritance from me.
Thank you.
Something about my family, and there are a couple of pictures, and it says, right, I made this in school, and it says right up here, my family. And the first page says, I like my family because they love me, and I like playing golf.
So they can hear you.
This is supposed to be something fun that you like to do, and I like swimming at the beach. Sometimes I swim.
Very good.
Nice picture, nice island. Yeah.
Maybe you want to write your brothers or your mother or your father. And I choose my brother, Jamie. And it says, I like my brother Jamie because sometimes when weird things happen, we like to solve mistakes together. And this is you, Jamie.
You have very long hair in that picture.
And this is actually the funny one. It was supposed to be about my dad. And it says, the best part about the day is when we get to wrestle at night, and this is me on the bed, and he's like beating me up, and I'm like, stop!
Very good.
And that's all I have.
Memory of Grandma and Grandpa, all of us.
You were invited.
Invited.
We were organized.
We were instructed to do that, and I thought for a long time, and I had a lot of sort of small memories. One of them being Lima, Ohio, and going down to Wendy's with the cousins, Springfield, and going down to Wendy's with the cousins with $5 bills that Grandma used to give us. But I couldn't think of very much detail for that one, so I decided not to make that the main story. And then I thought about going to Florida and playing with Conrad the cat, Grandpa's cat, and the story of the sad parting between the two when they left Florida, and also going to Cape Canaveral with both of them. But the story that I could remember, most of these stories were kind of hazy in my memory, so I couldn't remember enough details to make them into long enough stories. So the story that I most remember is a very recent one, which is how we all got here today. Which is Grandma calling me up and telling me that I needed on a weekend in last April, I think, calling me up and telling me that I needed to bring my car, and that Grandpa and I would be going out and guiding each 1/10 of a mile, or mapping out Madison each 1/10 of a mile. At each intersection we would have markers for people when they came into town, because otherwise people might get lost or run over drunken college students at 12 o'clock
It's a grandma survey.
at night. So we were going out to do this, but Grandpa wanted to learn how to use the internet also. And so I said, well, there's this great place on the internet called MapQuest, and we can go there and it'll give us mile markers, so we don't have to take the car out. So I spent maybe 2 hours sitting with Grandpa at the computer, putting in various different locations: the airport to Oakwood, Oakwood to the Hampton Inn to Susan's house, the Unitarian Society. And we came up with 5 different maps and instructions with all the different mile markers. So that's the memory that's the most clear, probably, because it's only 5 months old. But the other ones are kind of a haze. But I enjoyed spending time with both of you doing that. So
It's sort of an R-rated memory, but I'll say it now, and everyone will just be okay. I hope. I was the firstborn of the grandchildren, and so for a little while there was just me, and so I got the benefit of all the attention, and everybody wanted to take me around everywhere, especially because I was a little boy. So all the brothers and Grandpa would take me on these various excursions. And one that I remember that was a lot of fun, we did it a couple of times, is we'd get the canoe and we'd load it on the roof of the station wagon in Springfield, and we'd go and drive to the Mad River, which is a river that has various currents, but I think it's called the Mad River because it snakes like crazy. So if you park your car and unload the canoe, you can canoe for about an hour and a half and get out maybe 20 yards from where you parked and get back in the car. Well, anyways, I didn't know anything about canoeing, and Dad and Grandpa, Ted and Grandpa were showing me. So they put me on point and were teaching me how to paddle and steer the canoe. And we'd go down the river, and it would be fine until we hit some rapids. And there would be some low water and some rocks and some rapids, and they would generally form sort of bubbly little white water, and then they would come together in a sort of a V. And so the one memory that I always will remember, and it's going to stick with me, is their Grandpa's bit of wisdom about navigating the rapids when they came to a V. He said to me, head for the V and hope for the best. And that has always served me well in canoeing and in
You want
I
me
don't
to?
know, you just want me to start out?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. And if you can't hear, raise your hand so that he can adjust.
Now, at least 3 people in this room have heard this 3 times. She's her last at Mona College. They had a reunion of naval officers who had been to the Naval Japanese Language School right at the beginning of the war. And I went to it, and I gave this talk there. So that's the background on it. It's called The Pacific War's Best Kept Secret, Breaking the Japanese Codes. Are people hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful.
In February of 1943, as a newly commissioned U.S. Navy ensign, I reported to the office of Captain William Goggins, Chief of ICPOA, that is Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was 2 years after the bombing by the Japanese. said very sternly, the first thing I must tell you is that if you say anything to anyone about what you will be doing in here in this office, you will be court-martialed and shot. He went on very seriously. Our work is the most vital secret of the war in the Pacific. And I warn you not even to hint to the other naval intelligence officers whom you live with what goes on here. Well, what was I? Only 6 weeks an ensign, 2 weeks away from my wife and baby, and with no Navy officer training, what was I doing in this scary position? Well, the secrecy was broken in the early 1980s, when several books were published describing how all during the war we penetrated the Japanese codes. We were pretty successful at reading their military communications. Most important were their naval messages. So I'm now able to tell you about the part I played for 4 years in this game. It consisted of recording, unscrambling, translating, and making military sense out of the scores of Japanese wireless messages heard every day at our listening outposts in Hawaii, Washington, and Australia. And I will not be shocked. In fact, when it was all over, the outfit of which I was a part was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for our work in the war. When the war with Japan was declared in 1941, I was 24 years old. I inquired about military service opportunities for one with my background in the Army, Navy, and the FBI. It was the Navy offered me a commission as an ensign, USNR, if I would successfully complete their Japanese language course after, of course, being offered through the Reserve Officers Training Corps at the University of California at Berkeley. Since I could only speak the language, not read or write it, I agreed to take the course, getting myself from Pittsburgh to Berkeley at my own expense. I entered the second group in this special school, it only having recently started up. The class consisted of men in my age bracket, many with the same background as I, and whom I knew, plus graduate students from various universities who had majored in Oriental studies, including the Japanese. There were about 20 men in my group, and we started out with a rating of yeoman, second class. If you know the Navy, you know, that's the beginning. We did not wear uniforms. Our instructors were all Japanese Americans, skilled in teaching, and were bilingual. Classwork consisted of 2 or 3 two-hour sessions daily, 5 days a week. We covered conversation, reading, writing, and translating, both with English, from English into Japanese and vice versa. There was a great deal of homework involving the memorizing of both the Japanese written characters, called kanji, and of the spoken vocabulary words. Some of this was heavy going for me, and although I had no trouble with conversation or pronunciation, on the other hand, some of the graduate students who had never been in Japan had little trouble with the kanji, those written Japanese characters, but they had difficulty with conversation and pronunciation. Ironically, after we were commissioned, I spent no time during the war itself talking Japanese, not a word. While my best friend's first assignment was interrogating prisoners of war in Hawaii. As I recall, we had about 6 instructors, all Japanese Americans. It was because of this fact that the Navy Language Training School had to be moved from Berkeley in June of 1942. In spite of their American citizenship and their employment even by the U.S. Navy, our our instructors had to leave California under the Army requirement regarding persons of Japanese ancestry. So the school, the instructors and management, we students and our families all moved to the University of Colorado at Boulder. There the same regimen was resumed, continuing till December of 1942, at which time our group graduated. And I was commissioned an ensign. My graduation grade was 4.0. What does that mean? I took my family, including a newborn daughter, back to Lima, Ohio, Francis's hometown. And following this, I was given orders to report to the Commandant, 14th Naval District, for active duty at Pearl Harbor in the Combat Intelligence Center. I began duty there in early February of 1943. Most of our Boulder, Colorado language group received the same orders, but most of them were assigned to prisoner interrogation and captured document translation under the same command. I and 3 or 4 others, however, were introduced to this Captain William Goggins, with whose name and dire warning I started this talk. After expressing that warning to the 4 of us, he informed us that we would be part of the most secret work in the entire war effort, the breaking and reading of Japanese naval code messages. We each had to sign a document that we would never discuss this with others, even with fellow officers, if they were not in the code-breaking business. This proscription applied, of course, to any civilians, including my family and friends. It was not until well after the war, when books began to come out reporting how we won the war by breaking the Japanese codes, that I could even tell Francis what the hell I did during the war. I think she guessed, but I don't think she knew. Our immediate superior officer in the message translation room at Pearl Harbor was Colonel Alva Laswell, a U.S. Marine Corps colonel. Colonel Laswell was one of several regular Navy and Marine officers who had been sent on assignment in the 1930s to Tokyo to learn the Japanese language. To his group were now added us young reserve ensigns from Boulder, for a total of about 9 or 10 code breaker translators. Our daily work consisted of looking over sheets of paper with Arabic numbered groups printed in a vertical column on the left side. The column on the right side contained any Japanese words or letters which had been previously recovered. Our job was to figure out what word or letter went into each blank space and then to translate the entire message if possible. These sheets were printed by IBM machines from punch cards located in the so-called machine room back of us, into which none of us newcomers were ever allowed to go. These sheets represented radio messages to or from Japanese ships, warplanes, or shore stations all over the Pacific. Our people had a listening station on the hills above Pearl Harbor, and they copied down the list of 5-digit numbers that constituted a message. Since the numbers themselves were sent out in international Morse code, that part of the process was not difficult. These messages, each made up of a series of these 5-digit numbers, were then brought down by messenger, not telephone, not by radio, but by personal messenger, to our code-breaking unit machine room, where, as I described, they were key punched onto IBM cards, message by message, and printed. It was from these printouts that we translators worked. Each printout, by the way, bore in capital letters across the top the label Ultra. Not secret, restricted, or anything like that. Just ULTRA. Much of our work consisted in figuring out what a blank number meant, for in the early stages of a newly changed Japanese code book, there would be many blanks across from the intercepted 5-digit numbers. If we had enough readable material to read, for example, blank Maru will proceed to blank degrees north, blank degrees west for refueling. It was our job to research through looking up earlier uses of those blanks in other messages and try to make an intelligent guess at its meaning. We must have been successful, for Admiral Nimitz was ordering our submarines to intercept these Japanese Marus, that means ship, every day or so, giving the precise location. A young submariner friend of mine who knew in general that I was an intelligence work said to me several times, "Boy, that spy you guys I've had in Tokyo sure knows the stuff." I just smiled and agreed with him. One of my own better personal code recoveries came when I noted that invariably when one of their fighter pilots was shot down, they ended the radio messages with the same group of numbers, or in some cases a different set of numbers, but which no doubt meant the same thing. Some collateral study and other clues led me to realize that this was in every case a stylized wording of the phrase meaning, "He met a glorious death in battle." In Japanese, the words read, "So retsu naru senso wo togeta." As you can count, the phrase is made up of 11 syllables, so if the message ended in 11 code groups, it was a pretty sure bet that I had identified 11 different Japanese kana alphabet symbols. Of course, they had to be carefully tested in other contexts. For instance, if I came across another message with syllables already identified as oki blank wa, and the blank was revealed as the na in the death message, then I had identified oki na wa. Colonel Laswa gave me a nice pat on the back for this piece of work. A high point in the code-breaking area, one in which I took part, occurred in April of 1943. Our radio intercept translations made it clear to us that the enemy's Navy top commanding officer, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the entire Japanese combined fleet, was planning to make a personal inspection tour of the Japanese air bases in the northern Solomon Islands. My boss, Colonel Laswell, had the duty that day, and with the help of all of us, on his staff, he was the first to break the message. It was immediately rushed by hand over to Admiral Nimitz, who was just down the road from where our office was, who in turn sent a secret encoded message, quote, "For your eyes only," to Admiral Halsey, telling him that Yamamoto himself would arrive at Buin, that's a Japanese base about 300 miles northwest of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, at 0600 on 18 April in 2 bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Of course, by then we controlled Guadalcanal, and Halsey confirmed that the shoot-down would be undertaken by a dozen of our long-range P-38 fighter planes from Henderson Field at Guadal. Well, the attack took place as planned, shot down both bombers and 4 of the Zeros. We lost 1 P-38. When Halsey received the report, he is said to have commented, "Well, it sounds as if one of the ducks in our bag was a peacock." However, no public announcement by us was made of this event. On May 21st, however, Radio Tokyo announced that their fallen leader's ashes had been returned to Tokyo and that Yamamoto had been killed, quote, while directing general strategy at the front in April. He met a gallant death in a warplane. The shooting down of Yamamoto was a huge trauma for the Japanese. His death struck at the fighting morale of their navy, and the impact was intensified a month later when 1,100 of our 7th U.S. Army landed on Attu, the westernmost of the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, recapturing it from the Japanese. We figured it was the beginning of the end. Well, in August of 1944, I was transferred to our Washington office in a routine rotation, doing much the same work till the end of the war. I have no particular memories of that duty, except that it was great to be able to go home after each working watch to my wife and now 2 children. After the war, most of us officers in the Naval Intelligence Service who spoke Japanese were sent to occupy Japan with the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. My work was completely changed, no more codes and ciphers. Instead, I served as a language officer with one of the several survey groups that went to various cities and factory bomb targets to observe the effectiveness of our bombing techniques. It was interesting work, and for me an eye-opener on how the common Japanese people were reacting to the surrender. This reaction was almost totally positive and friendly. One day I was with a bomb survey group which was assigned to check a target outside Tokyo. When our group reached the town, we stopped to inquire the way at the local police station, and as always seems to happen, we were furnished with a policeman for a guide. He got in the Jeep that I was in so that we could talk, and as we rode along, the policeman kept looking at me as if he had something important to say. It was a very bumpy road and conversation was difficult. But when we ran into a stretch of fairly smooth road, he finally came out with it. Said he, and this was in Japanese, "I am truly grateful to America for bringing us peace. Before, it seemed as if hardship and suffering could never end. And now suddenly it is gone," he said. "Do you think everyone looks at it the same way?" I asked. "Oh yes, almost everyone." "How about the police?" "Well," he replied, "I think most of the police feel as I do. I realize that we have a reputation for oppressing people and preventing criticism of the war, but what else could you expect the police to do in wartime?" He went on to say, however, that even the police were struck by the fine behavior of the American troops. "They are," he said, "an inspiration to us. As representatives of democracy, they are winning many Japanese over to your way of doing things." "How long do you think we will have to stay in Japan to get the country started on the right road?" I asked. "Sa," he said. That's the Japanese equivalent of "you got me there." It is hard to say how long it might be, but I think we should stay till the job is done. I don't think the policeman told me these things just to please me. He was under no obligation to say anything more than right, left, straight ahead. And when we came to crossroads along the way, his sentiments must have been those of many Japanese at the time. For otherwise, Americans would not have found it as safe and pleasant to travel around the countryside. Many a time I rode around at night, alone, in a Jeep, unarmed, without any hint of danger. My whole war service was without danger, as it turned out, without suffering or any hardship. I was extremely fortunate to have interesting and useful work and to return to civilian life in 1946, almost 4 years to the day after I enlisted. Boastful, I got more applause than anybody else.
He was the only one of maybe 20 speakers over 2 days who addressed the code breaking. I don't know how it happened that way, because there were certainly other people who could have. But many of the other speeches were interesting, but people knew already what they were about.
And it was their opinion of what should we do with Japan?
Well, yeah.
Should we go on into China and kind of
He was
esoteric
the only code breaker
things
there.
like that?
I'm happy to say that due to Eric Tellema's cooperation and time, we have a tape for each of our 4 kids.
Yes. When Pearl Harbor was hit by the Japanese, both he and I felt, I figured certainly I'd be drafted. He was 54 at the time, and I guess he didn't know if he'd be called upon or not, but he volunteered and went to the Marines saying he could speak Japanese, and did they have a place for him. And they did not hesitate a minute. Are you getting stuff?
Sure.
I'm thirsty. He didn't have to go to school or anything. He spent his life in Japan. He could read and write as well as speak as well as I. So I don't know how it turned out that he was in the Marines and not in any other branch. Maybe he preferred that.
They were the best.
He chose.
Yeah,
He knew they were the best.
he was the toughest and they were the,
Anyway, it turned out he was assigned, he was assigned to the 1st Marine Division, and their assignment was to attack Guadalcanal, which they did. He did not have to participate in the physical assaulting, but as soon as any headquarters was set up, he was the guy that had to do the talking with the opposite side. And we have a photograph of him, I think some of you have seen it, talking to a Japanese prisoner. And the prisoner is very relaxed. Again, my father is unarmed, and they're just talking under a tent with the American intelligence officer listening in and getting the word. He was, as I say, he was commissioned at the age of 54 as a major. I think he ended up a lieutenant commander.
Lieutenant Colonel. Yes.
Colonel.
Yes.
But Rob asked about the tree. All we know is that at some point on Guadalcanal, when he was sleeping, I mean, they all slept wherever they could, you know, a palm, big palm frond, whatever you call it, fell on him and hit him on the hip. And he felt all the rest of his life that he was lame because of that. He also got malaria on Guadalcanal. But he continued to serve in the 1st Marines, and he had another landing, didn't he? Was it not Petaluma? Later,
He
they
was
stayed.
active in Japan.
Yeah, but he took part in the second landing on another island later. Welcome back in Japan as a missionary. There were quite mixed feelings in the mission aboard when he joined the 1st Marines. That is not what normally happens to ministers of, 54 years old. So he was criticized by other people on the board, and among the things they said was, you can never return to Japan. If you go in as 1st Marine, your career is over as a missionary. So he recognized that that was a strong possibility, but it did not stop him. And as it turned out, he loved the Marines. He was a very energetic and active and gung-ho person as a missionary, and it transferred easily, in his case, to 1st Marines, which is an odd story. Anyhow, he also ended up in Japan with the occupation, and Sherry and his dad ran into each other in Japan.
Luckily, both of them unarmed.
Yes, doing occupation work. So as soon as Sherwood got a little bit of free time, he decided to go back to his mission house. What did you call it? His social settlement house.
That he had founded.
That he had founded, and in the industrial section of poor workers in Osaka?
Osaka, yeah.
In Osaka. So, again, it was a chancy thing, and anybody who had advised him, which nobody ever could, would have said, if you're going back to your old place to see how it is, don't go in your Marine uniform. Don't go in your 1st Marine Division uniform, because you can't tell what the feeling will be, what the reaction will be. Well, the story, which is very sentimental, kind of romantic, is that he went alone and unarmed and in uniform, and all of the area around the social settlement house had been bombed and was leveled. The social settlement house stood, and as he approached it on foot, the word went out among people that Moran's son was back. And they all came out and gathered, and by the time he got to the social settlement house, his old clients and friends and congregation were all gathered there and were tickled pink to see him and embraced him, and as I say, ultimately, after he got discharged and back, the mission board took him back and sent him to Japan. He went back to the same job as a missionary and was still very well thought of and well treated and accepted by his old people.
I think we have to realize that people on top say, or you're in trouble. But that doesn't mean they all agreed or approved of it. And therefore, we ran into thousands of people, I take it, like that policeman with me, who was grateful for making peace and restoring Japan back to where they thought it should be. And I presume my dad ran into that thing.
And one of the things that made all this possible, Susan, I
We're
can't
fine.
see you. Are we
We're
all right?
fine. We're just
Okay.
fine, go ahead.
One of the things that made this possible was the decision by MacArthur, whom we all hated, but who did a lot of wise things, the decision to keep the emperor. And interestingly, at this Pomona conference, which brought 100 people who had been involved in some way in all this stuff, they were still arguing over whether or not the emperor should have been kept on. But the prevailing opinion was that indeed the emperor was a strong symbol, very strong symbol to the Japanese people. And with a few alterations, some of which were suggested by Daddy and his best friend, Otis Carey, in the emperor's behavior, he kept his position but altered it enough so that the people still trusted him. For instance, the emperor had never gone out in the public by himself. And one of the things they suggested was that he get on a horse or get in a carriage and ride around and be seen and, you know, bow and wave, which he did. And so the people were thrilled to pieces. They still had their emperor, and they had the best of both worlds with the trappings of democracy, which they took to very quickly.
Very small, very tough, very intense college. We live in San Clemente. It's an hour and a half away. We went up and heard him speak. And I don't think we can express how much we were so proud. He really was the premier speaker. There were 2 or 3 others that touched on information that he dealt with. Some of them were much more
kind of blasé and not that interesting. He was cogent, lucid, articulate, to the point.
Good words.
Well, I got it from you. So there's a lot here to be so proud of. This was absolutely crucial in World War II. So you did a great job.
Thank you.
Grandma and Grandpa for their cooperation, mutual support and empathy, and the resilience that I saw in each of them while Grandma was not feeling up to snuff. They were both able to shift roles and interact interchangeably to manage their daily lives. Grandpa geared up while Grandma shifted down. Grandpa made beds, did dishes and laundry, cooked, helped Grandma in and out of bed, and he also managed his own life superbly while Grandma was in the hospital for 2 weeks. And Grandma let him do all of this. On Grandma's part, she pulled herself out of a confusing and upsetting medicine-induced fog and has rehabilitated her ailing back diligently and superbly the last 6 weeks. What strength of character on the part of both Mom and Dad.
Thank you.
Second, I want to mention history. This is a message particularly for the grandchildren and other younger folks here. From my perspective, what we are witnessing this weekend in the celebration of a 60th wedding anniversary is a unique and historic occurrence. As we all know, personal relationships and the structures of family life are making major and dramatic social shifts. It may be that 60th wedding anniversaries will be rare occurrences in the 21st century. Although I do hope that some of the past relationship values will be carried forward into the future. But because of this sense of history, it is even more worthy to acknowledge Grandma's and Grandpa's achievement and to express appreciation for the 60 years of fidelity and exclusiveness of relationship that we are honoring here this weekend. I would...
Here, here.
Here, here.
Salute. Compare Susie favorably to Britney Spears. This, where Jerry is explaining who Britney Spears is to Grandma, this would have a wider audience, but still limited among those present. Seeing no other alternative, I thought that I would compare Susie to myself. And I can only hope that I or any of the rest of us here can spend so much of our time devoting ourselves to other people, to the greater good, to the greatest good of the greatest number in private life, but also in public life, as Susie. So this is a celebration of Mom and Dad tonight, but let's also raise our glasses and toast Susie.
Absolutely. And fears and worries and problems, but we have been so fortunate in our lives and in our children. And the best part, living where we do, which we love, but it has brought us in closer contact than we ever had been before with other people, our peers. And I have to say to you that without exception, our kids, our life, our past, even our health is better than almost everybody we know. And we hear really tragic stories of people's relationship with their children, estrangements that last for years and years, and other people who have no children, never had children, and who can scarcely conceal their envy when they hear what we're doing this weekend. So, the best part of our lives, beyond having each other, is that we have had such a marvelous family, and it is such a treat to have you all together here. I have been looking forward to it ever since you announced it on Valentine's Day. And fortunately, most of the planning was done before I went to the hospital. You never could plan too early.
Can't believe in that.
We'll get to the airport too early.
And I hear, you laugh at me, and I know it's funny the way I think. But one of my granddaughters said to me just a couple of days ago that she just couldn't understand how people could get along without making lists. And her life now revolves around writing it down, making a list, crossing things off. My best friend at Wittenberg used to say, the first thing to do is make a list, and the first item on the list is make a list, and then you cross that off, and you're on your way. Anyhow, it's even unto the third generation, some of our idiosyncrasies are showing up, and it's fun to see it. Thank you all so much. You've all been so generous, you've all worked so hard. Susan has been such a wonderful leader for all of us that we can't express fully how grateful we are.
From when I was a younger boy, which was when Grandma and Grandpa both lived in Florida still, and I was probably 9 or 10, and whenever we visited them, of course the nights were much nicer than in Massachusetts, and we would go and spend late nights outside, my grandfather and I. He would bring out the chair and sit on the lawn, and it would be 9 o'clock, and we would look up at the stars. And I was dumbfounded each time because he would point out what everything in the sky was to me. This is still the subject of debate between me and my father. I thought he could name all the constellations forward and backwards. My dad doesn't think that is true at all. But he certainly did know somehow which ones were the planets and which ones were the stars, which boggled my mind. And I was just 8 or 9 years old. I don't know if it was because I was blinded by his wisdom or because it was way past my bedtime and I was standing looking straight out for half an hour. But it produced a profound impression on me, and I really appreciated it every single time it happened. So I wanted to say thank you.
My memory is a little vague. It happened when we had our last family reunion in Maryland, and everyone was out doing the rock climbing thing, including, I think everyone from my family, but I was way too frightened to climb in a little dark hole, so I stayed at home with Grandma and Grandpa. And I had spent the last couple of days memorizing a poem from Charles Silverstein, who was one of my favorite authors, and it took me days to memorize. It was like 10 lines long or something. And I was very proud of myself, and it was a poem about a boy who sells his parents because they're so rough, and he goes off to the coal mines and buys a brand new pair off an infomercial. I thought it was funny, and I just, looking back on it, I think it was very nice for them to take the time to listen to a poem that was definitely not one of the most thought-provoking pieces of literature, I guess. And I guess I just really appreciate that.
A couple of somewhat vague memories, but just kind of why I enjoy when you guys visit and stuff like that. I remember when, especially in 29 Palms, when they visited, it's kind of silly, but they would help me with especially Grandma, with our cards, to cut off like the used part so you can still use like half of it, and then like string up the other half like on a string. And then of course baking cookies. That was a lot of fun. And then I remember in 29 Palms we took them out to the rocks, like the where people rock climbed, and had a little cookout. And I remember taking them around the rocks. They didn't want to go too high up, but I remember that was a lot of fun going around there. And basically, I just enjoy when they visit because it always produces a lot of fun times and stuff like that.
I don't have like pretty clear memories, but I have like two really special ones. They're kind of stupid, but they're funny. The first one was with Grandpa, and a long time ago at their old house in Florida. And you remember there's this tree in there, this like tree that like looked like cotton in their front yard. And, like I can remember being scared because it was so big, and I thought there were snakes in it. And Grandpa he told me what kind of tree it was, and that there wasn't snakes in it. And my memory of Grandma was pretty recent. It's happened many times. We were playing cards and we were playing slapjack. And I thought, she's not going to notice if I cheat. So I put my hand really close to the deck. And then she said, what are you doing? And I said, what do you mean? I'm just playing like you told me to. And then she finally figured out, and I was wrong, and then she slapped my hand, and she told me that's not what you do, and you have to put your elbow on the table, and that you can't just cheat. And I realized that you can't, if like you know someone's smart, you can't like try to like tell them something that's not true or do something that's not right.
Go Grandma. Ethics 101.
This is Susie's place, apartment. And this is the Sunday after church. Cheeky.
Switch.
Oh,
I don't have any idea how you could have heard Grandma doing it.
I want to be near you guys.
Okay, look at
That's right.
I don't know. Don't say history.
This is how we broke Grandpa's leg.
You can sit here.
Oh, all right. Hush, everybody.
Here we have a memory.
James has the floor.
Can I sit down?
Yeah, please.
I thought you wanted me to speak.
No. I just want to begin by saying that when I found out about this whole family reunion, I was totally overjoyed because as I'm getting older and I'm kind of beginning to witness exactly how complex life can become, I realized that getting us all together here, all my wonderful relatives all together here to basically celebrate our family, coming from so many miles away just for that purpose is really, really precious jewel, one of the most valuable things that can happen. So that's why I was overflowing with joy when I found out about this whole reunion. I was also filled with joy because I found out that I'll have a chance to talk and talk about how much Grandma and Grandpa mean to me. So, the memories that I have of spending time with this wonderful couple that some of us know as Grandpa and Grandma, and some of us know as Mom and Dad, Sherry and Francis, some of us know as Gumpa and Dumpa. Those memories are so deeply personal to me. It's almost like Eric when he was talking about he couldn't, he has so many memories and he couldn't remember a lot of the details. They run so deep in me and kind of in my identity of who I consider myself to be that they kind of just blend together a lot. But I do have a couple of stories that I want to dig out of the memory. And a lot of the times I remember that we spent time together was in my adolescence. Grandma and Grandpa would sojourn to Washington, D.C., and gratefully I was one who was always chosen by my dad to pick them up at the airport. And I considered that my quality time, when I would come and pick them up from the airport and drive them back, and we talk and stuff and catch up. And I remember one time I got to spend extra quality time with them doing that because I just turned 16 and I just got my driver's license, and I was so eager to impress you guys with my driving that I got totally lost. And I think Grandpa was actually the first one to realize this. And he quickly resolved to just sit back and enjoy the new scenery. That calmed me down too. So, the memories that I have also extend back to my earlier adolescence and my later childhood when I would visit Grandma and Grandpa in Florida. And I would go down there and basically for as many days that I would spend with them in their home, I just felt like a prince. I mean, I was basically spoiled silly. I got to go to all the best water parks, the amusement parks, just have a ball. And one time I went to Typhoon Lagoon, I remember, and the whole back side of me got seared lobster red by the sunlight. So Grandma immediately, first thing, ran out to the pharmacist and got the best sunburn care cream that money could buy. And you guys tended to me so well that when I was burned, that was the one and only time I'm sure that I'm ever going to enjoy actually being sunburned. It wasn't long before I was back in action and I was bothering those little green frogs that are all over the back porch light that Grandpa used to enjoy the company of. My memories extend back much further back, mysteriously further back into my childhood. I remember taking trips to the cozy house in a beautiful snow-blanketed Springfield. And I remember, from then I remember the bamboo patch in the back. And I remember catching cicadas in the cemetery behind the house. And I even remember getting bathed by you guys. we would pour a little bit of shampoo in the water as it filled up the tub so it would become nice and bubbly. Remember that.
Do you remember what Grandpa would put on his cornflakes?
That always puzzled the kids. He put orange juice on his cornflakes instead of drinking.
Because it all mixes together in your stomach.
Yeah.
I mix things up readily.
I just want to, before I end, I just want to say that more recently, Grandma and Grandpa, I've been thinking about Grandma and Grandpa a lot. And there's two reasons for this. One is everybody knows Grandma was in the hospital and she was sick. The other reason is that I think a lot of you know I've kind of recently taken up a daily meditation practice. And in the San Francisco Bay just recently, I was lucky enough to see a public talk and a one-day meditation course by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh. And the words that he spoke really resounded really very deeply within me. So I bought a tape of his to take home and listen to his speech. when I left, and I brought it home and listened to it, and he placed a lot of importance on family. And the way he described the relationship between ourselves and our parents was 3 into 1. And that means there are 3 things. There's our parents, there is our body, and there is our self. Our parents come together to put their essence together into the creation of our body. Every cell in our body is an indication of the totality of the existence of our parents. Therefore, our parents are present with us in every cell of our body. Our bodies are the vehicle through which we experience our lives. And therefore, our bodies are in fact ourselves. So these 3 seemingly separate things are really one. Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of an experience when he was sitting in meditation. He experienced a state of the absence of all desire and the presence of a profound kind of pervasive feeling of contentment. And in that experience, he said, "Daddy, we have succeeded." He said that because he didn't just feel, he knew his father's presence with him at the time. In that experience, he knew his father was with him. There was no doubt. So I just want to, in conclusion, just say that just as I know my father is with me, I know that my grandparents are with me as well. And I know that everyone here is with me. And when I feel that, when I know that, I feel truly, truly blessed. So.
Although I doubt that mine will be as fun. My first memory is about shopping. Ready, girl? Growing up, I wore a lot of handmade clothes and a lot of hand-me-downs. And every once in a while, a turtleneck from the Sears catalog. And it didn't particularly bother me until about 4th grade, when I noticed that I wasn't quite up to snuff. And I was lucky enough to go and visit Grandma and Grandpa several summers when I was in elementary school on my own. And Grandma made a deal with me. I think I must have been going at the end of the summer before I was going back to school. And Grandma made a deal that however much money I could save over the summer, she would double, and she would take me shopping at the mall. So I saved $12. Oh wait, in the meantime, I think somehow, at some point, my mom stepped in and said that she would double what I had made, and then we would tell Grandma. That was the number that she So I saved $12, and my mom gave me $12, so I had $24. And then Grandma gave me $24, so I had $48. And we went to the mall, and Grandma bought me a pair of Lee jeans, which I had been coveting for a very long time, and a pink polo shirt, and it had to be polo. And I don't know if you remember sitting and waiting for 3 hours while I tried on every shirt. Okay, the right one. So that's one.
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Very good.
And my other memory is much more recent. When I moved back to Madison from St. Louis before I moved to New York, I was lived in Madison only for 9 months. I think. And I had my own apartment downtown. But I spent a lot of time with both my parents and with the grandparents, and I was lucky enough to spend almost every Saturday at their house.
Sit on her lap and just sing lullabies to me, and I've never really remembered the words to any of the songs.
That's down in the valley.
Well, I taught you, we shall overcome.
She remembers Down in the Valley.
No, not the fighting
Down in the
songs.
Valley was a favorite. Yeah.